Sean Domencic, so I've written under the pen name before Thomas Hackett. So I come from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and I'm a Catholic worker. It's a recently formed community there called Holy Family Catholic Worker, and my wife Monica lives there with me, along with 5 other housemates. In addition, I work construction with an Amish company. A fun fact, many people, when they think Lancaster, they think of Amish, so have a good insight into their life there. And most of all, I'm the co-founder and director of Tradiste. It's an organization which we host a podcast, a website of easy essays inspired by Peter Marr, and other resources dedicated to the spread of Catholic social teaching. We also organize events with our sister organization, Catholic Social Action, and I believe it was because of our vigil at the March for Life this past January, that Debbie got in touch with us. And I'd like to thank you especially, Debbie, and the Goretti Group for this opportunity to speak here and for all of the good work you do, the Redemptorists, or rather this parish here, and the Redemptorist Rectory, which we've been graced to stay at. Such a blessing to be here, this beautiful church, this beautiful place, and as well to the New York Catholic Worker, if anyone here is involved or from there. Really thankful for the opportunity to get to make this pilgrimage to this site where Dorothy and Peter began their work so many years ago. So with that said, I was invited to speak on Dorothy Day and the pro-life movement. And to some people, this might seem like an obvious pairing. Dorothy is a servant of God in the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church opposes abortion, so it seems like it could be as simple as that. However, for others this might come across as strange. Dorothy is perhaps most popular among Catholic leftists in the United States, or leftists who aren't Catholic at all. She's best known for serving the poor while decrying the evils of capitalism, militarism, racism, and the like. For those who desire to follow her example of social justice Catholicism, a focus on sexuality and abortion seems pharisaical and authoritarian. Now, for many of those gathered here, you may already know that the Church has a social teaching which is confounding to the worldly political spectrum. For example, Pope Francis explicitly condemned racism. He put out the statement after the murder of George Floyd, but condemned the attempt of the German bishops recently to bless same-sex unions, which is surprising, confusing to many. The papal encyclicals have been fierce, both in their defense of the rights of immigrants, as well as their condemnation of contraception. Now, this pairing here has been called the seamless garment, the consistent life ethic, but it is perhaps best summed up in that phrase, Catholic social teaching, CST for short, which simply does not line up with the right or the left of modern politics. However, gesturing to CST isn't really enough to answer a question about Dorothy Day and the pro-life movement. Most practicing Catholics like to cite CST only when it agrees with them, which leaves Dorothy's legacy in an awkward game of hagiographical tug-of-war. On the one hand, conservative Catholic outlets have always been uneasy about Dorothy's pacifism and anarchism. Instead, they focus on her works of mercy, and especially on her repentance, upholding her as a saint for mothers who regret their abortion. Some traditionalist Catholics, of course, would dismiss her entirely as heretical, as a communist. And on the other hand, liberal and leftist Catholics are uneasy about Dorothy's traditionalism. They often portray her submission to the hierarchy, her sexual morality, and her reverence for the sacraments as private, personal devotions, which should be separated from her role as the co-founder of the Catholic Worker. The Catholic Worker itself, both as a magazine and as a network of autonomous houses, has struggled for a long time since her death in 1980 with the question of how to engage with the pro-life movement, which of course is only beginning at the very end of Dorothy's life. I'd like to propose that neither of these stated attitudes are truly sufficient. If we want to learn what Dorothy has to teach us in the struggle of the pro-life cause. For if anyone here tonight comes from either the conservative or progressive background, I'd ask you to join me in learning from a holy woman who escapes the limits of both. So to begin with Dorothy's views, first, let us be clear. She did not make a legal ban on abortion as a focus of the Catholic worker movement. But this is because Roe v. Wade only occurred in 1973. Dorothy's life comes at an interesting time. As the sexual revolution was unfolding, she was in the final years of her life, and she was very sharply critical of it. In 1972, she said in the Catholic Worker, quote, "When it comes to divorce, birth control, abortion, I must write in this way. The teaching of Christ, the Word, must be upheld," unquote. She also frequently made reference to the encyclical Humanae Vitae, which came out in '69 around that time, which declared the immorality of birth control. She says, quote, "Thank God we have Pope Paul, who upholds respect for life, an ideal so lofty, so high, so important, even when it seems he has the whole Catholic world against him," unquote. She's referring there to the widespread opposition that Pope Paul faced. There was many entire universities, entire religious orders that were openly decrying Humanae Vitae as a wrong move by the Vatican. However, it's only many years after that we seem to take it for granted that that's an orthodox opinion. At the time, everyone expected the church to cave on the topic of the pill. Now, this was the year that she wrote that quote about Pope Paul in 1973 of Dorothy Day's last arrest at age 76. While protesting with Cesar Chavez for farm laborers, her health put her in a state of what she called semi-retirement very soon afterward. In 1974, she did sign a statement of the Catholic Peace Fellowship, which called the Supreme Court decision, Roe v. Wade, quote, "an abdication of the state's responsibility to protect the most basic rights of life," unquote. She made her last public appearance only 2 years later and went to God 4 years after that. So as we can see, Dorothy was not here in the flesh to guide us through the 1980s, during which the pro-life movement was beginning in the first place. And the pro-life rhetoric and movement quickly became attached to the Republican Party, whereas social justice rhetoric became attached to the Democrats. Sadly, as time went on, Catholics became even more entrenched in one of those two camps, instead of looking to Dorothy and others for an example of genuine Catholic social teaching. Now, I'd like to consider her views, that we do have this clear evidence of what she believed about abortion, about birth control. I'd like to delve into a topic of Dorothy that I think adds a depth to her view, something that gives us deeper context not only to why she believed it, but why she is an example to the pro-life movement and to how we should engage with pro-life politics in our day. And that's Dorothy Day's theology of the body. I've selected a few of Dorothy's direct comments about abortion and birth control, but this is perhaps what's least impressive about her pro-life witness, which is, of course, a reiteration of what the church is saying all along. Rather, what makes Dorothy an interesting model for our times are her theological insights on sexuality and social justice. I mentioned earlier that Christians dedicated to social justice often feel uncomfortable or opposed to speaking about sexuality in moral terms. What's interesting is how much Dorothy spoke, and very frankly, about the topic. Now, I'd also like to note that Dorothy's life comes at a very interesting time. She was coming of age precisely in the sort of proto-sexual revolution that happens leading up into the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties era. And this is when she's coming of age, when she's becoming a woman. And it's in 1980, at the very end of her life, that the sexual revolution that we often refer to, the promotion of birth control for the first time on a very large industrial scale is happening. So her life fits very interestingly into this period. And it's not something that she was unattached from and happened to live through. It's something that was deeply affected her community, her life, and her personality. So here I'd like to draw a contrast with St. Augustine, who is well known for having lived in sexual sin for many years before his conversion. And Dorothy, she greatly admired St. Augustine, so he's an important example here. Indeed, St. Augustine was one of the first Catholic thinkers that she read while still a teenager, long before her conversion, and his articulation of the desire and yearning, in Latin, eros, we should develop towards God, always formed a central part of her spirituality. Her well-known autobiography, The Long Loneliness, begins by calling to mind Augustine's Confessions. You'll see in the very first section, she frames the entire autobiography as a confession in the style of St. Augustine. This makes Dorothy's approach to sexuality even more confusing, because Augustine is often blamed, perhaps unfairly, for the sex negativity of the Middle Ages. That is, the view that sexuality is dirty, impure, only barely permitted by God, as a concession to our weakness. The opposite, quote-unquote, sex-positive view is attached to Pope St. John Paul II's Theology of the Body, which was developed in a series of sermons beginning only a year after Dorothy's death in 1980. Despite the time of her passing, I believe Dorothy has these important contributions to the theology of the body before it even began, because of her personal and political experience, which enabled her to understand both the beautiful and the horrific elements of sexuality. Like St. Augustine, it was Dorothy's years of lust and fornication which gave her insights into just how harmful and shameful sexuality can be when misused. Her pain goes even deeper than this, however. She had an abortion in her, she doesn't write about it in her biography, but in that phase of her life. And afterward, she was extremely sick, immediately abandoned by the father, and emotionally devastated to the point of attempting suicide. She regarded this period, only privately, and only began to speak of it at the very end of her life, as the central tragedy of her life. Based on this experience, she can say with authority that, quote, "When sex is treated lightly as a means of pleasure, I can only consider that woman is used as a plaything, not a person. When sex is so used, it takes on the quality of the demonic, and to descend into this blackness is to have a foretaste of hell, where there is no order, but everlasting horror dwelleth," unquote. Elsewhere, she writes, quote, "The poisonous fascination of sex, its deadly allure in the abstract, I felt it then in its most hideous form, and there was no beauty in it, no love, but it was like the uncoiling of a dank and ugly serpent in my breast," unquote. For years after the abortion and after these dark experiences, she thought herself barren because of the way that the procedure was botched and so horribly performed. And so Tamar's birth, much later, came as a surprise, a divine blessing. She often compared herself to Hannah and to others in the Bible. A barren woman has given forth fruit. By this time, God had reawakened her conscience. But while she presented both herself and her daughter to be baptized, her lover, forster Batterhand, the father of the child, an atheist and an anarchist, refused to be submitted to the institution of marriage. In one of her last letters to him, written in 1932, she tries to explain to him, quote, "Sex is not at all taboo with me, except outside of marriage. I am as free and unsuppressed as ever. I think that the human body a beautiful thing," unquote. She goes on to describe her deep sorrow that he will not commit himself to her. She says, "You think all this is only hard for you, but I am suffering too. The ache in my heart is intolerable at times, and sometimes for days I can feel your lips upon me, waking and sleeping. It is because I love you so much that I want you to marry me," unquote. Later, she reflected that her conversion was not a rejection of sexuality, but a completion of it. Quote, "It was not because I was tired of sex, satiated, disillusioned, that I turned to God. Radical friends used to insinuate this. It was because through a whole love, it was because through a whole love, both physical and spiritual, I came to know God," unquote. As a woman destined to become, in her own words, an unwilling celibate, she cherished the spousal and intimate union with God, and emphasized that Christ is the bridegroom to the church. Based on the writings of many saints and mystics, Dorothy's personal theology of the body was an essential part of her relationship with God, which allowed her not to be haunted by guilt, but liberated by true love. She writes beautifully on this topic. She says at one point, quote, "The analogy of bridegroom with bride teaches us, as no other method could, that the love of God is one almost of equality. we having been elevated to the supernatural plane by grace, of deep and intimate and lasting affection as between spouses. Unquote. This appears in many of her works. It's not a theme that she necessarily speaks of openly as something that was a central part of her mission. Of course, she was leading the Catholic worker, and these questions of social justice were very central. However, in her reflections, one sees this as a constant theme throughout the pages of the Catholic worker. In her writings on pilgrimage, which were her sort of stories of her life as a Catholic worker. She has sort of several series of these that she wrote and published throughout her lifetime. It's a theme that often comes up at certain points. And whenever the topic is presented in popular media of her day, and it was a topic that the Catholic worker was addressing, it's always something that she turns back to. This idea of what really is theology of the body before it was named. This emphasis on the way in which the sexual is taken onto this true and deep level of our intimate union with God, of the bride and bridegroom. And it's precisely this, for Dorothy, what made sexuality, when abused, when misused, so dark and horrible. She had a very personal connection to this. It was something that she had experienced, all of the pain and suffering that it involved. And so this story of her journey, this turning towards this deeper love that was in her life, this loneliness which was fulfilled in God and that intimate union with Him, is something that I think serves as an important insight of Dorothy. Obviously, we have much of this. We think of this as all being something that comes from St. John Paul II. And of course, he's drawing on this across mystics through history. There's many mystics and saints who write on this theme, and it's only in the 20th century that we begin to see it collected and emphasized and publicly preached as the theology of the body. But I think Dorothy deserves special attention for this, as someone obviously from our own country who has began this process long before others had begun to contemplate the theology of the body, but also, as I'm about to note, how it should tie in to pro-life politics into our day, and the Catholic social teaching of how to teach this and preach this and live this out in the world. So, to go into that question, how do these insights on sexuality go hand in hand with her witness to social justice? It can seem difficult to fit together. On the one hand, you have this sense of a restrained and austere life, this sense of boundaries, of limits, of order, of all the constraints that entails. And this is often associated with the right, with conservatism, with rigid morality, or the institutions of traditionalism, one might say. On the other hand, you have this sense of the emancipatory, that which is seeking freedom, this egalitarian vision, a project of liberation, the overcoming of oppression, all the things that we tend to associate with the left, with progress, with this other vision of liberation. The answer to squaring these two things, because we clearly see both of them, we see this sense of the egalitarian vision, this project of liberation. We see also this sense of restrained, austere life. The way that we square the circle between the two is that Dorothy's politics are based on love. Love, in the deepest sense, comes with many limitations. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. There's much that it is not, what it is limited from. But it comes also to set us free, to lift up the lowly, to bring all mankind into communion and peace. There is a universal aspect to the way that love operates. For Dorothy, the moral law which demands that we give up our comforts to serve Christ and the poor is the exact same moral law which demands that we give up our pleasures to honor God in our bodies. The self-discipline which denies the cravings of the flesh is the same which patiently serves the poorest among us. In one of her columns, this comes later in her life, and of course in the 60s, as there are beginning to have these hippie groups, free love groups and such, which certainly there were some who interacted with the Catholic worker in a long history of interaction between these various rival groups in the Catholic worker. There was a group of beats who came to the house, and they were promoting and living out free love among them. She notes, however, in one of her columns that she was very frustrated with them, not only because of this aspect, but also because they were greedy with food and housing, moving around as if they did not notice the poor. My criticism, she says, was that they despised the life forces within man, that they were nihilistic rather than pacifist, that their attempt was directed against the very body of man, that temple of the Holy Spirit, and that all the four-letter words they used so glibly and reminiscent of our prison days was to express this contempt, this hatred, unquote. And so we see here this aspect in which Dorothy is frustrated by the sexual revolution happening, not only because it violates the moral codes of the Catholic Church, but because it also violates the spirit of love in the gospel, because it does not contribute to this building up of a society in which the poor are cared for, in which there is this restraint and austerity and limits that allows us to love the least among us. She saw the exact same in the acquisitiveness, the desire in our society to acquire, to gain, to dominate others, in our systems of economic predation, of usury, of exploitation, and in the many sexual sins and evils that dominate our society and culture, more and more so since the 60s and 70s. Here is the pro-life movement of Dorothy Day, one in which we honor life as a gift from God, which sees Christ in the hungry, the sick, the immigrant, the unborn, the worker, freedom from oppression, which does not mean freedom from mere human social restraints, but something far more radical, liberation from the flesh, the devil, the world, and all its sinfulness. And so finally, with all of that in mind, I'd like to conclude with what her relevance is to today. So we spoke of how she relates to the pro-life movements, and these are all important reflections, but I think there's some very concrete ways in which we can seek to live out this example, in which, whether involved with the Catholic worker movement or not, merely inspired by it, we can seek to live out that witness to Catholic social teaching, the witness to the peace and justice of the gospel, in a way that in no way has to abandon or distance itself from the pro-life movement and the struggle to defend the lives of the unborn. I propose three things, and the first is simply to stand up for the unborn. The popes and bishops have emphasized that abortion is the preeminent issue of our time. This can seem like something where we have to make an unfortunate choice between aligning with a conservative issue versus aligning with a progressive issue, but it is really a question of standing up for the weakest among us. We have this teaching from the church, we have this desire to emphasize it from our leaders in the church, from the teaching of the church, and from what we know abortion to be. And so we have this obligation to stand up for the weakest among us. And of course, this means more than merely overturning Roe. This means also supporting pregnant mothers. This means doing everything that we can to provide for persons who are considering abortion, to all of the circumstances which come in their lives, which are often lives of great difficulty, a willingness to adopt, a willingness to provide housing, food, all the other amenities, not just on the sense of supporting these on a social level. Obviously, supporting them can be an aspect of that, but being willing, and as Dorothy and Peter always emphasize, to make a personal sacrifice. This is what should define Christian witness, being willing to do that. We can certainly support the political project of helping pregnant mothers, say, but it can only be done with sincerity when we ourselves are willing to give up our luxuries, to invite others into our home, to be willing to adopt. These things are something that there are so many resources in the church, so much wealth, so many people who enjoy great blessings, and in which we fail to contribute radically to the pro-life movement because we reduce it to voting a particular way or simply posting or tweeting a particular way about abortion. The second, after standing up for the unborn, the second is to discover the theology of the body. We hear Dorothy, she says at one point, we know our children are being presented with other points of view, and it is time indeed that there should be more talk on the subject of sex and marriage on the part of Catholics, unquote. Much of what the theology of the body comes from is the sexual revolution. It's a response to it. It's a need to take this theology, which has always existed in the church, but present it in a new way because of these cultural upheavals that we're going through. There's a need to respond to all of these new evils that our future children, that we ourselves are being presented with. And so Dorothy, I think, the reason that she begins to discuss theology of the body before Pope John Paul even begins to discuss it is because she witnessed it. She saw the need that there was to be reframing. Among radicals, there was always a little bit, among the leftists, the socialist anarchist groups that she originally came from and continued to work with on social justice issues. She saw that they were pushing the edges of what was considered sexual morality or was considered legitimate. And so had a need to respond to that long before it was something that had exploded into every aspect of our society. And so now that it is here, we should be taking that witness. We need to understand the theology of bodies so that we can respond to the sexual revolution. And this is not merely for personal, private virtue. It's also to explain the political vision. When one speaks of rejecting abortion, of rejecting contraception, of traditional marriage, of all of these things, it can easily come across as something that is purely a fanatical desire to repress others, to force others to your religious values. Rather, these are not arbitrary rules of God, but rather this is his beautiful plan for sexuality. And unless we're able to explain it in terms of that beautiful plan, it's going to sound like hypocrisy. It's going to sound like oppression. So this requires a generosity. And a generosity not only in how we describe and understand these things, but also how we live it out, right? We shouldn't be living out chastity out of a desire of repression even for ourselves, right? If that's our relationship to chastity, then we have the wrong relationship to it. And we're certainly not going to be able to explain it to make it compelling to someone else. So we need that generosity of our bodies and our wealth likewise. These are the generosity of giving our bodies to God, of giving ourselves to God, and likewise of our possessions, right? So the reason I bring that in is that we have to be a compelling witness. And that's something that Dorothy was. Part of why she doesn't appear as a hypocrite, right? If she wasn't someone that was living a very comfortable, a very, very opulent bourgeois life and then desiring to put restraints on sexual morality on others, but rather she was someone who's living a life of total devotion, of dedication. That's central to what theology of the body means, right? It means understanding sexuality in terms, not only sexuality, but our entire bodies, right? In terms of that gift. We receive them as a gift from God, we give them to others, either in the married state, in that lifelong gift, or to God in the celibate state of that very intimate and personal gift with God himself. And so in either case, that generosity needs to go hand in hand with voluntary poverty in whatever way that we need to live it, but certainly that was a central element that made her witness to sexual purity convincing, and her ability to speak on theology of the body as something that could be heard by those around her. And so the third thing is to strike at the root of the culture of death. And this perhaps gets into the greatest tragedy of the pro-life movement. And the reason that it's failed to accomplish anything for these past 40, 50 years is precisely that it's allied itself to the forces of mammon in our society. We have to understand that the arguments for abortion, the reason that it can even exist as an institution, only becomes possible because of the insane individualism of our capitalist society. The fact that we have so far gone away from God for a long time, for hundreds of years, it has led us to arrive at this point. It's not a system that was perfectly fine in 1950 and exploded in the 70s, as often is spoken of in the pro-life movement. Something else that Dorothy often emphasized is that abortion has a unique tie to the oppression of the poor. She talks often how it was often framed as a cure for poverty, a mercy for those who couldn't live better lives. We certainly hear this rhetoric today. And long before the popes were saying the exact same thing in their encyclicals, Dorothy was refusing to accept the argument that overpopulation was a cause of poverty. Abortion wasn't the hot topic issue of the 40s and 50s, but contraception was. Birth control, according to Dorothy, was nothing less than a trick used by capitalism to blame the poor for their own misery. She frequently condemned the lie as such, agreeing with Chavez and other Black and Latino radicals that, quote, birth control and abortion are genocide, unquote. And so this is another important connection, the willingness to recognize all the ways in which abortion and contraception serve as part of an industry. Sometimes spoken of that in the pro-life movement, but then that rhetoric immediately stops when we begin to look at other exploitative industries. There's a need for consistency there, and also to recognize in the way, we often speak of consumerism being a bad thing, but we don't recognize in the way that this is tied to the way that capitalism desires to free all of our desires, to put them on the market, to make us a more acquisitive, consumptive society, focused on ever greater acquisition of accumulation, rather than on gift, on a willingness to restrain ourselves to a need to give to others. And so that connection there is central to getting to the root of how we even got here in the first place. As a Catholic worker, I certainly consider it a duty to attend pro-life events. But when I do so with Tradiste and the others who come with me on these events, others in our network, we make every attempt to, as Dorothy said, afflict the comfortable. She was fond of the phrase saying to comfort the afflicted, inflict the comfortable. And we often go with signs, for example, that would say, end abortion, end capitalism, right? We get lots of interesting conversations spawned from those sorts of signs. And I think there's a need to really reevaluate what our commitment to the pro-life movement looks like. There's a long history of failure in the pro-life movement, and not just the specific pro-life movement, but the whole of trying to turn back all of the evils that are involved in the sexual revolution. And again, I propose that the reason for that is because we've tried to ally with the forces of conservatism, broadly speaking, that often support these same industries, these same policies, this same vision of the world, which is very much in favor of sexual liberation, so to speak. And so we can learn from Dorothy's political wisdom that we can never be free of sexual sin and the slaughter of the innocent unless we topple this system of economic injustice. Dorothy called herself a distributist and was very fond of G.K. Chesterton, who wrote famously, "It can never be said enough in our modern day that it was capitalism and nothing else which destroyed the family." And this is Chesterton writing back in, I believe it was 1917 or so that he's writing this. Think of what it means to have written that in the early 20th century compared to where we are in the 21st century. And yet, many of us have still failed to make that reckoning. So in conclusion, we should stand up for the unborn, not just generally or politically, but also personally. We should discover the theology of the body, the riches of the Church's teachings on what our bodies are made for. And finally, to strike at the root of the culture of death, to recognize the forces in our society that have led to sexual immorality, to all of the evils that we see around us, first and foremost among them abortion, and consider how we can create a society that is focused on the family, truly focused not just culturally, but economically as well, focused on the family, on love, on gift, on the peace and justice of the gospel. We should be inspired to fight, as she did, for a world where it is easy for men and women to do good. I'd like to close with a prayer. In the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, we pray, God, our Creator, your servant Dorothy Day exemplified the Catholic faith by her conversion, life of prayer, and voluntary poverty. Her works of mercy, her witness to the justice and peace of the gospel. May her life inspire people to turn to Christ as their Savior and guide, to see his face in the world's poor, and to raise their voices for the justice of God's kingdom. We pray that you grant the favors we ask through her intercession, especially that of a culture of life and an end to abortion, that her goodness and holiness may be more widely recognized, and that one day the church may proclaim her saint. We ask this through Christ our Lord.
Amen. So I want to thank Sean, but we do have a few minutes for questions. So I do also want to point out that in the front row here, we have three very special people. So if they don't mind, we have Philip and James from the Catholic Worker right down the block. And we have the man who created this beautiful painting of Dorothy Day and actually knew Dorothy Day when she was living here in the city. His name is Jeff. And these cards are on the back table outside. So we welcome questions right now. It could be for anyone, or if you'd like to speak to someone after the event, you can do that as well. So we just want to thank the Catholic Workers for being here tonight. And we're just so excited to have this Q&A. If anybody, I do need a volunteer though to be the runner with the microphone if somebody, so that I could still film it. Would somebody like to? Thanks, Omar. Okay. Well, he might be asked a question, so thanks, Omar. Does anyone have a question for Sean or for any of the Catholic Workers here tonight? Oh, go ahead.
It's not a question. I would just like to thank Sean for his very clear and accurate presentation of the thought of Dorothy and using her own words, which over the years, myself and many others, as you all know, have written about her, talked about her, but I've often have said that it was easy to give a presentation about her. For me, if I usually just quoted her, rather, but anyway, you did a fine job, and I hope you have other opportunities to present the fullness of Dorothy and her understanding of the church teaching, but also what she called the personalist Christian view of life. So the message is ever currently needed, even among various so-called Catholic worker communities in New York and throughout the country.
Thank you so much.
This is Jeff's painting. I'm just going to show everybody at home. Thank you so much. So, does anyone else have any questions? Okay. Or comments too. Or any comments, welcome. Can you use the mic? Oh. It died? Sorry. Okay. It needs to be charged, maybe. Okay, sorry. Okay.
And the narrative was that euthanasia, specifically a right to euthanasia, was a working class labor issue, and that's like kind of something that gets ranted about a lot. It's like any given social issue is a labor or a racial or a class issue. So it seems like at some points, like the values, like which values and how they interact with class relations are fungible. So how do you address that kind of what appears like confusion in the secular left, especially about this issue?
It doesn't work. I think it needs to be charged. So, sorry.
I'll just do my best. So the question was on euthanasia, and you were mentioning the Jacobin article, and I did see the Jacobin article because I've been off Twitter for Lent, but I got back on, for Eastertide, and saw that, and was like, I can remember why I got off. I think there's sort of two ways of approaching it, and the question being there, in conversations on the left, broadly speaking, on Voice of Jacobin, for those not familiar, is probably the most popular like socialist magazine out there. And so there's, again, two ways of approaching it. One, which is pointing out that these values, it's an unfortunately common thing, and I think Dorothy was really keyed into this, of socialists to speak in the name of the worker and the working class, but not necessarily, having a real, like, it's not like a representative body, it's a group of particular people who are taking up this mantle. And so recognizing that a lot of the sort of social values that we would consider, farther from the church's teaching, that are more progressive, and I'm speaking here of like sexual purity and those sorts of social values, tend to be something that comes from the wealthiest in our society, right? Like, it's in the West, it's in developed countries where we see the largest access to contraception, to abortion, where the social attitudes are the most liberal and progressive. And so in relation to the world, and even to our country, right? If you look at these values in terms of economic status in our country, it is often the poorer who have traditional ideas around contraception or abortion, sexual morality. And certainly in the world, if you look at the global South, something that's a really important element of the church's discussion of social justice is that the global South has largely been attacked by the values of abortion, of contraception. Like, these have been pushed onto Latin America, onto Africa, as ways of trying to bring them into the capitalist economy, of being able to commodify sexuality more, because these are places where traditional values actually still hold some sway. They haven't been totally set aside yet. And so that's one end of it, of just the fact that, like, the actual values of the poorest in the world are largely still traditional. But that, of course, can be dismissed by leftists will saying that, well, they haven't yet gone through the sort of process of becoming, of waking up to the modern world and recognizing, the class struggle as it is, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I think another thing that has to be pointed out, the other sort of approach, is the way in which these systems of, so-called liberation, that many socialists will take up the cause of abortion, take up the cause of contraception, don't actually contribute to that process. Something very important to certainly Dorothy's vision and to a lot of distributists and a central idea of Catholic social teaching generally is the role of the family in society, and recognizing how the family has a real contribution to society. It offers this place of economic stability, of cultural patrimony, of passing down these values, and importantly, it offers this school in which we learn to grow up, right? Like, everybody comes from a household, everyone comes from a family, and when you have things like contraception and abortion, which inherently attack the family, right? Like, often the freedom that socialists are speaking of is freedom from the family. It's saying that, generally it's framed in a sort of feminist way of, like, the woman is oppressed by the family, motherhood is an oppressive sort of thing, and so we have to free people from it, and that's where contraception and abortion comes in. And so when you have that attitude of the family is an evil institution, is a bad thing, that doesn't really line up with any real sense of liberation, because, when you look at what's actually good for people, the supposed goal of any liberation project is to contribute to people's flourishing, to their well-being. And so I think that the way that I certainly try to approach that is the fact that if our goal, and it very much is to eliminate the forces of exploitation, of capital concentrated in this oppressive way, and distribute it, and create a society where people can flourish, can more easily participate in the common good, that has to come with the vision of the family. And then an important sort of historical point to prove that is, like, the one issue that leftists win on is social issues, and that's because there's actually no interest among capital, and by that I'm meaning, the billionaire class, right? there's a desire for these things to contribute. You know, I cite in Tradiste, I have a number of easy essays on this topic, and one of them, you know, I cite the fact that there were some Republicans in Georgia trying to push some pro-life legislation, and 180 CEOs of some of the biggest companies in the country signed an open letter in Washington Post saying how abortion is bad for the economy, right? And it certainly is. It is bad for the capitalist economy. It means like mothers not being able to work at home and needing to work, you know, at Walmart or Amazon or wherever else is good for them. And so, you know, that's an issue that we see that there's often like this movement towards more and more of that, and it's I think in many ways very foolish that leftists, because, you know, secular leftists, because they have these preconceived desires that, you know, this is a good thing, that these social values are important, will try to frame them as working class issues to the detriment of both the actual beliefs of the working class, especially in the third world, but also to the actual good of people. It's simply not good for the family to be eliminated from society. So I think those are certainly two ways in which I try to answer that question. And I think Dorothy's example of how she approached birth control is really helpful to that, because she saw all of this back in, you know, long before this was a way that we even discussed things. Was that loud enough? Did you guys hear that?
I don't think so. Thank you. Anyone else? Any comments or questions? Oh, Father.
A bit more general, but I'm wondering about this idea, because I've been in a pulpit plenty of times, and it's very easy for your message to be reduced to what people want to hear, like you alluded to. And when you bring up things like Catholic social teaching, subsidiarity, distributism, if people aren't acquainted, it's jargon, and they'll take what they can and adjust it. Now, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's attributed to Dorothy Day. Don't call me a saint. I don't want to be dismissed so easily. Whether she said that or not, I leave to you.
She did.
But I can understand the sentiment, because we live in a culture that reduces to sound bites. Arguments are not translated in full. We have a media that's not interested in the actual conversation. And so we're stuck in the situation of that Brazilian bishop in the 60s or 70s who said, when I feed the poor, they call me a saint. And when I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist. So I'm wondering if there's anything from Dorothy Day's life you can point to breaking beyond the typical conversation. And again, you've already brought up, we're not this, we're not that. But simply saying you're a Trinity quid, simply, you know, trying to distinguish yourself as not this, not that, isn't going to cut it, right? So do you have anything else on that from her witness that could be
First, the Brazilian bishop is Elder Hammer, who is a cool guy. I'd recommend him. Called the Red Bishop definitely actually a little less of a traditionalist than Dorothy, certainly, but a great quote from him. But yeah, so I think that something maybe that I think is really helpful, and then I think Dorothy and Peter Marin, for those not familiar, the co-founder of the Catholic Worker, Dorothy actually would always call him the founder. She very much saw him as the kind of, you know, the root and origin of the order, or of the movement. But you're right, that one of the issues that we kind of fall into is of saying, well, we're not really, you know, proper Republicans, we're not really proper Democrats, you know, we're not really on the right or left, or, you know, etc. But then, because we can say, like, we're not really either, we can say, like, well, we're not really either, but, you know, we kind of, like, you know, ally with these guys because they're the closest, or we ally with these guys because, you know, that's the sort of prudential way of doing our best. And so, I think that presenting not just, like, a negative vision and saying, like, well, you can't be fully on board with this, and then you kind of just got to figure out your own thing, and then you end up kind of being sucked into one or the other. I think it's really important to present a positive vision, and not just say, well, we condemn, you know, capitalism and socialism, and we condemn, you know, whatever, you know, on both sides. We condemn abuses of immigrants, and we condemn gay marriage or whatever. I think the key thing is presenting that positive vision. And so like that's, for example, why I think Dorothy's vision of theology of the body is really important. Like it's not just a matter of, I condemn this and that, but rather I have a positive vision for, how things ought to be. And so this is where I find, you mentioned personalism, a phrase that JP2 was really fond of, and that Dorothy Day and Peter Marin were really influenced by, writings like Emmanuel Mounier and such. And then later, part of JP2's magisterium really picked up the word personalism itself and promoted it in encyclicals like Laborum Exercens. So yeah, I think having that language, one of our goals with Tradiste is to kind of provide that, to go in that direction of saying like, what is the Catholic social teaching program? What is the vision for it? Ideas like distributism, personalism. Pope Francis has coined some really helpful words like integral ecology and such. And obviously they can become buzzwords, like you said, that's always a risk. But it's not like we're just, using the buzzwords and there's no meat that they lead to. Like if you go down the route of distributism and personalism, you will find some great content of the social encyclicals of, people like Dorothy and Peter and Chesterton and Belloc, who obviously influenced the CW movement a lot. So I think that's a key element of being willing to teach these principles kind of in the same way that we teach things like the Trinity, transubstantiation, etc. And those are really important, that we have like a word to it, we have a formula. And you can, of course, go deeper and deeper and deeper with these things. You can get a doctorate of theology and still be, far from understanding them. And yet, we do have at least that introduction. Whereas, if we're not willing to put some names to the teachings of the Church here, to these doctrines, to really bring them out in the same way we do catechesis, I think that's maybe one of the key things that's lacking in how we approach that. Is that helpful? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, well, I think the academic thing too is, that's something really important too, is that the only people I think that, hear about, like you do get to some degree, you get like the speculative theology does come into a religious education classroom, or you hear it from the pulpit. Well, it ought to, but if anything does, it's at least some of that. You might get some Trinity, you might get some transubstantiation, and I've seen some very bad religious ed, but there's at least been some basics, that get down in that way. But I think it really has been. Peter Marin said in one of his early easy essays, he says how the Catholic social teaching has been wrapped up by the scholars, or not by the scholars. He liked the word scholars, hated the word academic. It's been wrapped up by the academics in pretty phraseology, and it's been put in a jar and hermetically sealed, and they've sat in the lid. And it's high time that the Church blow the dynamite of Catholic social teaching. And I think that's a key thing of getting it, into the pulpits, into the pews, and something that there's a vision for the Catholic worker is very much that that comes with living it out as a witness. It's not a merely speculative thing. Like once you understand and learn about how the world ought to be economically, or what the purpose of money is, what the purpose of our material goods is, what usury is, and what, et cetera, like when you understand that, it informs your decisions about how you live your lives. And so then, you have to begin to live that witness. And I think that's a key part of it. And Peter Marin had a great vision of there being like a Catholic worker house in Dorothy more in every parish. And so that vision, of having a place of those intentional communities that are living this out, are spreading the truth of it, right? And that is especially a vocation of the laity, since they have this job to perfect the temporal order. I think that's a key way that it needs to progress. But certainly, hearing it from the pulpit's good. So, would love to, do some pulpit pounding sermons on distributism and see how it goes. Get back to me. I'd love to hear that. Yeah. Any other questions, comments, concerns?